People always get emotional and encourage others when they see the small guy, the last team, or the underdog getting near the top. There are plenty of examples of this throughout history. However, a great example of this is also when game developers that work in their projects with such passion that they even got sick from working so much on a game because of the scope of their own creation. These people can work in a game for endless hours just for it to be relegated to a small print because of the player base not being enough to justify more copies. A prime example of this is the massive hit from Square Enix selling over 6 million copies, Nier Automata, directed by the now popular figure Yoko Taro, someone who's been in the game industry directing and writing games since the PlayStation 2 days, where he took his own twisted ideas into his first direction job in Drakengard, a game that combined the gameplay of Dynasty Warriors and most importantly a unique style of storytelling that is now the signature of his narrative. Drakengard sold well enough to consider Yoko Taro as a capable director and writer. However, he was never truly recognized for a true major hit until 2017 with Nier Automata. Just after 15 full years and 2 previous titles, Nier and Drakengard 3, he is now actually getting recognized as a true mastermind in the gaming industry. Yoko Taro, like Monolithsolft, the creators of the Xenoblade Chronicles series, are true examples of something that took many years of work, evolution, experience, overcoming bad sales, bad reviews, and cutting projects due to the lack of support from the publishers to become one of the most popular series of games for their own platforms. Xenoblade Chronicles, originally presented as Monado, the beginning of the world in E3 2009, a Japanese exclusive game for the Nintendo Wii, which was not considered to be released outside of their own territory, but became popular because of the multiple requests from the fanbase of this company's work via a full fan campaign called Operation Rainfall, which was created primarily to bring this game overseas, but later added 2 other Wii RPGs, Pandora's Tower and The Last Story, by the Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. This project was advocating for a full localization of these 3 games, and was able to get enough presence to be featured in big gaming news outlets like Kotaku, Game Informer, Eurogamer, and IGN, just to name a few that helped with the popularity of the project. All 3 games were released and localized in the end by different publishers in 2011, but the task was done, and players were able to experience these games in their own regions. Xenoblade, however, like most of the RPGs released by this developer, received a limited print, and adding to that a store-exclusive deal with GameStop that spawned a complete fiasco of them selling new copies as used for over the retail price of the game, and ended up taking a hit in the overall sales metrics, making Xenoblade one of the most valuable games in the Wii library, with an asking price of over $100 for a complete used copy by 2013 in the American region. Despite this turmoil, Xenoblade was able to achieve critical acclaim and numerous nominations for RPG categories in several award shows at the time, giving praise for the epic storyline and characters that traverse a massive land full of things to discover. Not to mention it was accompanied by one of the best soundtracks in gaming. This was really starting to look like the push Monolithsoft needed to get the attention and funds for bigger projects in the future. Of course, we cannot forget where these developers came from. This was not the first time they were receiving critical acclaim and enough sales numbers for a generally good release. Before Xenoblade, there was Xenosaga, and before Xenosaga, there was Xenogears. Tetsuya Takahashi, director and writer in the Xenoblade Chronicles titles, first started these roles in his own project, Xenogears, while working in Squaresoft, currently known as Square Enix. He was able to create one of the most ambitious stories anyone could experience at the time. However, this ambition was a big factor that compromised the development of the game in the end, getting out of funds and time when nearing its completion. They were forced to release Xenogears in an incomplete state that hindered the experience for many players. Yes, I am speaking about the infamous second disc, where the gameplay, which was a very consistent classic RPG experience, with turn-based battles on foot and the gears, which were the big robots used in combat, and also featuring big, well-crafted cities, dungeons, a world map, another top-tier soundtrack composed by one of the main composers of Xenoblade, Yasunori Mitsuda, and a narrative that tied everything together, was changed to an almost full visual novel where the characters tell the story through events, and 80 to 90% of these events are not playable. This was the major factor that pushed many players away until this day, where I see threads and comments of people asking if they should only play disc 1. However, I want to put my personal experience in this for a minute. I knew about this when I started the game, and I took my time until I got to the second disc, where the graphic novel style was introduced. I enjoyed the gameplay a lot, but like every game, it has its flaws, mostly feeling a bit monotonous monotonous by the later dungeons, and sometimes I felt like the story was carrying me throughout the playthrough. Since it was my first time experiencing it, I didn't mind the change in gameplay for the second disc, because by that time the story is in its climax and every piece of narrative and dialogue is so important and focused in the events that I just wanted to know more. And then I had the breaks where gameplay was implemented again, so I could then give my full focus understanding the story once the narrative was brought back. Just because of this and how the story impacted me, I didn't mind the second disc at all. But I don't know if this would be the same if I play this game again, since I already know what will happen by the end. Despite these problems with the release, the game saw a great number of sales in its own country of Japan, but with much smaller numbers of sales overseas in America, grossing over 1.1 million copies sold. Xenogears was not released in Europe at all, and the sequel or prequel was never developed. After Xenogears, Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga founded Monolithsolft in 1999 with the intention of having more creative freedom and the possibility to visualize their world building through new ventures. This time Namco would have the task of publishing their new project after Xenogears, and continuing the ambition to tell a massive tale. A 6-part project was first envisioned, however it was ultimately cut in half. In 2002, Xenosaga Episode 1 was first released exclusively for the Sony PlayStation 2, only in Japanese and later in American territories, followed by Episode 2 in 2004, which included an European release 1 year later, and then 2006 saw the release of the epilogue in Episode 3, again just in Japanese and American territories. Xenosaga focused its story on a futuristic universe around two main characters, Shionusuke and the android Cosmos, who was first introduced as a combat weapon against one of the main enemies of the series, known as the Gnosis. I really don't want to give a lot of details in this game's story, since, in my opinion, Xenosaga's narrative is one of the most creative and complex stories ever told in all kinds of media, although I could think of this as one of its main problems for new players. There is a big focus in storytelling similar to the other games, but here you watch cutscenes for 15 to 30 minutes at a time in between gameplay sessions. Think of this like the Metal Gear games for a more popular reference. Because of this and the level design, the game can feel very linear, especially compared with Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenogears, which feature more open areas. This is not a bad thing, of course. If done correctly, this gameplay style works, especially with its great turn-based combat style, which is excellent once you understand how it works. We all know about the Monolithsolft in-game tutorials by now, I believe. It took me at least some external searches to understand it enough for me to go through the games, especially Episode 2. But this is true for almost all of the Xeno games. Continuing with the exploration style, it does have a PS2 RPG feel. The best example I can think right now is Final Fantasy X. You go through the levels in a linear fashion, stopping in the eventual town, which is a bit more open-ended, and then continue to the next area to follow through the same process. Because of this and the narrative style with the longer cutscenes, I believe Xenosaga as a trilogy is the most difficult of the Xeno games to get into for new fans, especially if they go back from the Xenoblade Chronicles games. I really advise those who didn't get enjoyment from the first game and left it unfinished after trying it right after the Xenoblade Chronicles games to give it another go. But this time don't expect something specifically like the Chronicles series. I've seen people ditching Saga because of that before. This is its own experience, and once the story and gameplay clicks, you will not want to stop playing these titles. These three games still look beautiful today, and the art style and soundtrack are nothing other than incredible, for the most part. Xenosaga saw great success with its first episode, with over 1 million copies sold a few months after its American release, in February 2003. However, numbers decreased with each sequel, and none of its later releases got the attention or the numbers Episode 1 received. Even if Xenosaga was not the success it was envisioned to have, the series is still referenced in many ways in current media, with Cosmos herself having a spot as a rare blade in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and multiple features in games like Namco X Capcom, Project Cross Zone, and a costume in Tales of Vesperia, just to mention a few examples. The decrease in sales for the Saga sequels is one of the biggest issues when trying to get these games today. Used copies for Episode 1 are sold for up to $30, Episode 2 for up to $50, and especially Episode 3 with its $200 average asking price. If you own a copy of this game, take good care of it. It's a shame that these games are still stuck in a 20-year-old console, if you don't want to emulate them, of course. I believe it's really time for these games to be released again, so more people can truly appreciate one of the best stories in gaming. In 2007, it was announced that Nintendo had bought the majority of Monolithsoft's shares from its parent company, Bandai Namco. Monolithsoft started its venture with Nintendo with development of other games outside of the Xeno titles, and although this was not the first time this company was working with Nintendo, having released other JRPGs for their consoles like Baten Kaitos and Baten Kaitos Origins in the Nintendo GameCube, or even the Japan-exclusive Xenosaga 1 and 2 game for the Nintendo DS. It took until 2010 for Nintendo to release the first Xeno game in their current system at the time, the Nintendo Wii. As I mentioned before, Xenoblade Chronicles did not start with the Xeno name in mind. This was later added out of respect for the creator of the series. The first time that Xenoblade was presented to the public, it went with Monado, Beginning of the World, as its title, shown in the E3 2009 trailer. This was really starting to show the beginning of Monolithsoft's comeback with a game that truly represents what they can achieve and believe with their own take on storytelling and world exploration. And Xenoblade Chronicles was exactly that. Releasing in 2010 in Japan, over a year later in Europe, and over 2 years later in America, although not an impressive number by today's standards, Xenoblade Chronicles sold a welcoming almost million copies, satisfying the demand of its niche fanbase at the time, but most importantly showing the world that there is still space for the Xeno series in the market, and opened the opportunity for more games developed with similar ideas in future releases for Monolithsoft and Nintendo. Xenoblade Chronicles generated a lot of critical acclaim because of its story and character writing, incredible music, but also the massive environments that seemed impossible to see in Nintendo's weakest console compared to its rivals that were already experimenting with HD graphics. Speaking of this, probably this is one of the major reasons why many people skip this entry. Even though the environmental work was well executed, the character design in the game was a step down even for their previous title in Xenosaga Episode 3, where the characters look better than what Xenoblade Chronicles was able to achieve in the Nintendo Wii. However, in 2020, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition released addressing that exact problem with the character designs, giving them a more modern look, much like Xenoblade 2 graphical work. In my opinion, a step in the right direction, but I've seen many people referring to the original design as the superior version. Also, this new version addressed many quality of life issues and a brand new story titled Future Connected that was envisioned as a way forward for the future of the series. And this version became, as the name implies, the definitive edition of the game. After this version of the game released, it became the second best-selling game in the series, just behind Xenoblade 2, which was the first game to surpass 2 million copies sold. Xenoblade Chronicles was the turning point for Monolithsoft. Shulk, the main character of the game, was later added to one of Nintendo's biggest IPs in Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U and 3DS, with its own stage that later went to Smash Ultimate, as well as several music tracks from the game in both Smash games. Not to mention the several cameos of characters in other games, as well as in their own sequel, where both Fiora and Shulk appear as blades in the DLC pack. After the success of the first Chronicles game, a spiritual successor was developed for Nintendo's next home console. Xenoblade Chronicles X was released in 2015 for the Wii U. This title is perhaps considered by many as the weakest release in the series. Comments for the story being more like side content and character development weaker than Xenoblade 1's really hindered the experience for many of the players. But the saving grace was the gameplay and the newly added open world to the series. This last characteristic specifically was one of the selling points of the whole experience. A dense land greatly populated and full of events, locales, and enemies to discover, unlike the previous large interconnected areas of Xenoblade 1. This was a seamless experience, only having a loading screen in the main hub area of the game when entering New Los Angeles. Think of this loading area like Skyrim when you enter Whiterun or other big cities where a loading screen is required. This and the newly added mech vehicles that the player could use to traverse the land were the main difference for the gameplay of this and the previous title. Not to mention the direction in the story from the point of view of a mute character. That wasn't really a change for the better in my opinion. In the end, due to the low sales of the Wii U itself, Xenoblade Chronicles X did not achieve the success or overall legacy like the previous title was for so many. I would like to talk a bit more about this game from a personal perspective, but it's the only one I haven't played. I have the Wii U and even 2 copies of the game. However, this is the longest game in the series, clocking over 110 hours for casual playthroughs with some side content. So this one is was really one to commit once the game has started. I will take a look on this game in the near future, that's for sure. We just got to the one that started it all for, I believe, the majority of the Xenoblade fans today, including myself. And the game that finally placed Monolithsolft as one of the key partners for Nintendo, not only for development support for other titles like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild or Animal Crossing, but for the one original IP created by their own imagination, which has been worked for almost 20 years by the end of 2017, when Xenoblade Chronicles 2 released worldwide for the Nintendo Switch. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was the last big first-party game released in the initial year of the Nintendo Switch, something that truly elevated the sales of the title since the Switch was already outgrowing previous console numbers historically, and holiday 2017 was the best time for the game to come out, for it to have the chance to get into the hands of as many players as possible, even if this was their first Xeno experience. It was exactly how and why I got it in the first place too. After a full year of big releases like Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8 and Mario Odyssey, Xenoblade 2 had the big task of ending Nintendo's streak of incredible experiences in their new console by the end of its first year. And even if there were mixed opinions when the game came out for both new and old fans of the series, especially regarding the art style of the game, which aimed for a more anime aesthetic. However, this could be another whole conversation by itself. There were also a lot of critical acclaim for the gameplay, which completely changed its combat style compared to previous titles, as well as the music, which again was a top-of-the-class soundtrack worked by the same artist that made the previous title, also accompanied by the legendary Xenogears, Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, and Xenosaga 1 composer Yasunori Mitsuda, but especially for the massive scope it had and its world and character development that turned the experience to more than just another game in the platform. It really was a turning point for me as a video games enthusiast, someone who never put a lot of attention into game stories, their philosophy, and character development as much as I had to put into Xenoblade 2 as a whole to truly understand what it was aiming for as a unique experience, that to this day I haven't been able to find in any other game outside of the Xeno series. Xenoblade 2 ended being the bestseller in the whole Xeno series, achieving almost 2.2 million sales by today. And even if you think this is not really a big number compared to other titles that quickly reach 5, 10, 15 million copies sold, you need to remember that this is a developer and a franchise that went from having 1 million unit sellers going down to just over 200,000 for some of their best works. And having one of their most ambitious titles in Xenoblade Chronicles 1 itself not having an American or European release at first, which changed due to the support of its then niche fanbase. I don't think you can say Xenoblade is a niche franchise anymore, having 3 different characters in Smash with Shulk from Xenoblade 1 and Pyra and Mithra from Xenoblade 2, not mentioning how Xenoblade 3, a game that hasn't come out yet, was able to break Nintendo of America's storefront for over 10 hours when the special edition went live the 8th and 28th of June of this same year, due to the amount of people trying to buy the game. I'm still very sour about that day as a Nintendo fan. However, I am extremely happy about that same day as a Monolithsoft fan, because it was the day that everyone realized how Xenoblade became one of Monolith and Nintendo's biggest projects now. Xeno as a whole is the life's work of a passionate team of people that started with an ambition to create some of the most intelligent and complete stories in games out there for the last 20 plus years. It took many tries, many ups and many downs, but most importantly, a lot of experience and evolution that was ultimately what got this same team of people to where they are now. It's time for Monolithsoft to get the attention they deserve for the last 2 decades. I know Xenoblade Chronicles 3 will be as good as me and everyone else is hoping it to be. Let's just hope there is a way in the future to revisit some of their older titles, which I know are completely able to surpass a lot of players' expectations once they become easier for everyone to get. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please consider subscribing if you like this content. Let me know if Xenoblade 2 was your first game in the series like me, or if you started with any of the other titles. Thank you very much for your time. I'll talk to you in the next one.